Yan naman, Chi. Yan na.
Iyon,
Yan naman, Chi. Yan naman, Chi. Yan naman, Chi. Yan naman, Chi. Sorry, I have to go. Thank you.
Good luck, Alex. Laban.
A woman is standing behind a chain-link fence at 6 in the morning, phone-raised eyes locked on an empty practice court. And she has been there for over an hour before anyone shows up. And the strange part is she isn't alone, because behind her there are dozens more than hundreds, all staring at nothing, all waiting for a player who hasn't hit a single ball yet. And somewhere in that crowd, a veteran tennis reporter who has covered this sport for over a decade is standing there quietly, visibly, rattled, because none of what he's watching should be happening, not in this city, not with these numbers, not for a player who isn't even seeded to make it past round 2. And that's the moment you need to sit inside for a second before anything else makes sense. Because what's unfolding at the Lindner Family Tennis Center in Mason, Ohio right now on paper is basically impossible. This city has a Filipino population you could fit into a single high school gymnasium, somewhere close to 2,000 people. And yet the scenes forming outside these practice courts look like something you'd expect from a 250,000-person diaspora turning out for one of their own. And the people whose entire job is understanding crowd behavior in this sport are the ones who look the most confused, which tells you everything. Because when the experts don't have an explanation, that's usually where the real story is hiding. So rewind, because none of this happened in a vacuum, and to understand why grown adults are camping outside an empty tennis court before sunrise, you have to go back a few weeks to a tournament. Nobody was circling on their calendar a mid-tier stop in Washington, D.C. that most casual fans wouldn't recognize by name, and somewhere inside that unremarkable week, something shifted that nobody saw coming. She fought her way through it, clawing back from behind in match after match, and it built to a final that ended with her beating a former Wimbledon champion and then breaking down in tears afterward on camera. Not staged tears, not manufactured emotion for a highlight reel, but the kind of raw, unfiltered release that happens when years of struggle finally crack open in front of a camera. And that clip stopped being a sports moment and started traveling to people who had never watched a tennis match in their life. That was domino number 1. Nobody knew yet how many more were coming. Then Toronto happened, and this is where the story stops looking like a good month and starts looking like something nobody had fully clocked yet. Because she made a run to the 4th round of the National Bank Open, and the crowd noise inside that 12,500-seat arena got so loud, so chaotic, that she went on camera afterward and compared it to being inside a packed neighborhood gym during a hometown basketball final. Not a polite tennis crowd clapping politely between points, but something closer to a block party that had somehow relocated itself into a professional sports arena 1,000 miles from where she grew up. And here's the detail that should stop you cold. It wasn't just her fans who noticed. The woman who beat her that day, a former world number 4, walked over to the stands after the match and thanked the crowd anyway, acknowledging out loud that most of them had clearly been rooting for her opponent, not for her, the actual winner. Think about what that means. A player who just won still felt the need to publicly recognize that the room belonged to someone else. That's not crowd support. That's gravity. That's a pull strong enough to bend a stadium even when the person causing it loses. So by the time Cincinnati rolled around, you would expect the intensity to cool off. Because this tournament sits right before the US Open, it's supposed to be the quiet stretch, the tune-up week, the calm before the real storm in New York. And statistically, with barely 2,000 people from her background living anywhere near this city, there was no reason for any of what happened in Toronto to follow her here. And yet it did. It followed her into a city that has almost nothing built to sustain it, which brings in a name that carries real weight inside this sport. Rennie Stubbs, someone who has watched decades of hype come and go, who has seen manufactured buzz collapse under its own weight more times than she could count. And when she starts talking about this player, she doesn't talk about her like a flash in the pan. She frames this exact tournament as the real test. The moment that proves whether Washington and Toronto were a lucky, unrepeatable streak or the beginning of something that actually holds up under pressure. And then she says something that should make you pause, that no matter how deep this run goes, more people are already talking about this player than ever before. and that people inside the sport genuinely believe she has the power to pull an entirely new wave of fans into tennis. That's not throwaway praise. That's someone spending decades of credibility on a bet about a player who is still technically in the early chapters of her story. But here's where it gets uncomfortable, because all of this adoration, all of these people lining up before sunrise, is building directly ahead of a match that could end everything before it really starts. She enters as the 17th seed, which earns her a bye straight into round 2, and waiting there is one of 2 players. And neither name should make anyone in that crowd feel comfortable, because right now she doesn't have a winning record against either of them. Start with the worst possibility. If it's the Romanian across the net, the history is brutal. A losing record, a 3-set defeat at the US Open qualifiers the year before. And this isn't a player limping into the tournament either, because days earlier in Toronto, she pulled off a stunning comeback from 4 games down in a set to beat an American opponent in 3 sets. Which means, if this matchup happens, it's not just a player she's never beaten, it's a player freshly reminded of exactly how good she is at stealing matches that already looked finished. Now flip it. If it's the Polish veteran instead, the surface picture looks friendlier and even split across 4 career meetings. 2 recent wins in her favor, but dig 1 layer deeper and there are 2 losses buried in that history too. And this is the same player who, months earlier, knocked out a 5-time Grand Slam champion at the Miami Open, which means underestimating her would be a mistake nobody in that crowd can afford to make. So here's the tension sitting underneath every single person camping outside that practice court right now. They are not showing up because the outcome feels safe. They know exactly how dangerous this draw is. They're showing up anyway. They're showing up anyway. And that single fact changes everything about how you should be reading this crowd. Because this isn't blind, guaranteed win fandom. This is people choosing to stand there for hours despite knowing the story could end in heartbreak within the next 48 hours. And that kind of loyalty doesn't get built by convenience. It gets built by something deeper. And there's another layer buried underneath all of this that makes the whole scene even heavier. Because this is her first time ever playing this specific tournament. She was supposed to debut here the year before, but a shoulder injury forced her out before she ever stepped on the court. So this isn't just a talented player walking into a hostile draw. It's a personal milestone arriving on the back of the single best stretch of her career, and also on the back of one of the most physically brutal stretches she's ever pushed her body through. Nearly 2 straight weeks of high-pressure tennis, an exit from the tournament in Canada, barely any recovery time before landing in Ohio, her team working overtime just to keep her from breaking down physically. And she's been open about how staying healthy right now matters more to her than almost anything else. She is not walking into this arena fresh. She is walking in running on fumes, and somehow the people lining up before dawn seem to understand that completely, and they show up anyway, treating a practice session like it carries the same weight as the actual match. Now here's the piece that reframes everything you've just heard, because to understand why this crowd behaves the way it does, you have to understand where she actually came from. And it isn't a polished academy pipeline story. It's cracked courts, gaps in the netting, no fencing to stop a stray ball from rolling into the street. A country with almost no infrastructure built for producing a professional tennis player, let alone one who could compete on this level. And that kind of beginning, when it finally breaks through, tends to create the most loyal, most emotionally invested fan bases in all of sports. Because people aren't just watching talent. They're watching someone climb out of almost nothing in real time, and they feel like they're part of the climb. And every time reporters ask her about crowds that have turned entire cities into something resembling a home match, she keeps circling back to the same idea that the support was never really about her individually, that it belongs to something bigger than one person, and that it keeps expanding right alongside her, city after city. That kind of framing matters more than people give it credit for. Because a player who pushes the spotlight outward instead of hoarding it tends to build a relationship with an audience that doesn't fade over time, the kind that multiplies instead of leveling off. So zoom all the way out, because here is the piece that should genuinely unsettle you if you sit with it. Tennis fandom has historically been built on proximity, decades of infrastructure, local federations selling tickets specifically to one community, generations of families who show up every single year because that's simply what their community does, and she doesn't have any of that here. No decades of built infrastructure, just months, a handful of results, one viral tearful interview, one dramatic comeback title, one electric night in a Toronto arena, and somehow that alone generated a crowd that mirrors a city with 250 times the built-in population to draw from. That's not a fan base she inherited. That's one she's actively constructing in real time. One tournament at a time in front of everyone watching. Community-driven support is powerful, but it's limited by geography. It only shows up where the community already exists. But crossover fandom doesn't play by those rules. It follows the person instead of the population. It shows up in cities with almost no built-in connection to her at all, purely because people have decided on their own that they're fans of her specifically, the same way people around the planet become obsessed with athletes who have zero personal tie to their home country. And once a player crosses that particular line, there is functionally no ceiling left on how far this can travel. Which brings us to the part that should make everything you've just heard feel like a warm-up act. Because the US Open is only a few weeks away, and New York is home to one of the largest, most passionate communities of her background anywhere in the country. A population that dwarfs what she experienced in Toronto, let alone the tiny group currently packing itself into Ohio right now. If a city with barely 2,000 people from her background is already producing scenes that stun veteran reporters into silence, ask yourself honestly what happens when she walks onto a court in front of a community measured not in the thousands, but in the hundreds of thousands, fully mobilized, fully aware of exactly what they're witnessing. Cincinnati might not even be the peak of this story. It might just be the preview. And there's one more thing worth sitting with before any of this plays out on court, because crowd energy isn't just background noise. Players talk constantly about how a supportive crowd can shift the actual rhythm of a tight match, how it can hand you an extra half-second of belief on a break point, how it can carry your legs through a third set when your body is screaming at you to stop. And she's already proven this season